National Mentoring Community, All Things Mentoring Lounge. I'm Dr. Stephen Hobbs, co-founder of IMC with Doug Lawrence. We'll explain a little bit more about who we are. But the topic today is mentoring, reframed. You could say reimagined, reinstall, other ways in which to look at that word. Well, what we're doing is we're halfway through the year of 2023, well, almost there. And Doug and I have had some conversations about the why and how of mentoring. And what does it mean for us going forward? And that's what we wanted to share a little bit with you today. Now, we may not hit every highlight that we want to get across today, but there are two things we want to do is just explain a little bit more about what we're doing using terms like reciprocal and holistic as it applies to mentoring, and then just share a little bit of an update about where we're going with IMC. Now, again, remember, IMC is International Mentoring Community. It's just a little easier to say IMC than the long version of our community. So I think, Doug, that's sort of where we're going today. So I believe it would be helpful if you just want to briefly introduce yourself. We'll do a little bit more from myself, and then we'll jump into this topic today.
Sure, I can do that. So I'm Doug Lawrence. I'm one of the co-founders of the International Mentoring Community. I also have my own mentoring practice, Talent C, focused on all things mentoring. And I am the author of You Are Not Alone, which is an Amazon #1 bestseller focused on mentoring and mental health.
And that's great. And just to emphasize the fact, Doug is in deep practice as compared to myself. I tend to more write around it and then support in my capacity as Director of Certification Verification for the IMC. I tend to make sure that all the background is in place. Doug does a lot more of the foreground kind of work, and certainly encouraging people to get into the community and then support them as they travel, walk, glide, canoe, whatever way you want to talk about going through the community. Doug is there to help out. So with that brief introduction, there is often what we do is we just share the definition of mentoring that we use, but we're going to hold off on that today just a little bit because some of it's going to get slightly nuanced in terms of where we're going. And that's why we wanted to share today's presentation with you. And again, just to emphasize, we want to take a look at why we're talking about reciprocal, holistic mentoring approach, and to be able to bring that to the foreground, especially at this point where we are in 2023, which brings up the second point, just going over a little bit more about what we're up to, where we're going with what's taking place. So I'm going to be making a little bit more of the presentation today. Doug will just be sort of sharing. He may actually get drawn away at some point in time, so you might notice his screen goes blank. That's okay. There's something happening in his office area, and he needs to take care of it today. It's just one of those things. That's what happened. So we just wanted to acknowledge that at the beginning. So one of the things I want to acknowledge as well is that mentoring is still, a fabulous way in which to foster personal and professional learning, development, growth, whatever words you want to put in there. Whether that's on an individual basis outside of an organization or even inside an organization. So a lot of the work that I do is I guide olders to be elders, in particular, those who might use a word like aging or they're an ager. Some of those that I really lean into are those who are solo agers. They don't have kin around them. And so some of them have left the organization and they're just moving through life, doing lots of other kind of things. And I'm encouraging them to get involved from that capacity. But Doug you have a little bit more of a connection to the professional to the personal because some of them are still employed. You want to just share a little bit about that perspective?
So for the most part, it's Well, it can be a combination of things, but it's helping people transition through the organization and using mentoring as a means to do so. It's about helping the development process or the developing of leaders within the organization as well. And then, looking at it also from the aspect of the entrepreneurial individual who is wanting to start a business and move forward, and what does that look like, and how can I achieve the goals that I want with or without a mentor?
So very much both of us in a sense are, it's either guiding someone who is still employed in a sense to become either a deeper, richer in their practice of being a paraprofessional professional, or acting in a professional way. All right. Sometimes entrepreneurs may not necessarily be professionals as, the more regulated definition might be, but yet to act more professional in their approach, they can certainly do that. There are those who have left and are looking at, well, I was a professional, paraprofessional, or I acted in a very professional way. What can I do in these next 50 years? Maybe it's to support people who are coming through. It might be this notion of mental health. There's lots of things that can take place here. And to really emphasize that mentoring is one of the educating approaches that can just lean into all of what it is that I've just shared and Doug has shared, because this notion of a reciprocal holistic approach. And that's why we wanted to bring these terms forward more than what we have done in the past. We just started, I'd say probably the last 2 videos, we've mentioned it, Doug, and so it's time to really bring it to the foreground, because in the definition we talk about two-way, this notion of mutual, reciprocal. That's always been there, linked into collaborative conversations, and that sort of is leaning into holistic. But we may not have really explained what holistic was about. And what we're wanting to do today is just bring to light a little bit more around reciprocal, a little bit more about holistic. And this notion of reciprocal is the notion of reciprocity. And it's something that we have woven into the profile while you're working on your certificate of practice journey mentor, is really understanding about what does reciprocity mean, because a lot of the older models in many ways, it sort of seemed to be one direction, right? The mentor to the mentee, and the mentor go, yeah, well, I shared what I needed to share. Take care. See you later. And that isn't quite what we're attempting to do, is that there's a much more dynamic living arrangement, dynamics in businesses, and finding out ways in which to organize the work in this dynamic flow that's taking place. It just can't be this one directional, follow instructions, sort of robotically say, yes, I will get it done kind of idea. There's a lot more that has to happen, this dynamic learning environment. And the new generations that are coming in are asking for this. There's just no way you can get around not doing this. But what becomes interesting for me is in developing this collaborative partnership, people have said, well, we don't really need to worry about the reciprocation aspect. And sometimes a mentee might go, I don't really need to worry about it. I can just go to Google. Heck, I can go to ChatGPT and get everything I need to be able to learn to do what I need to do. And I go, interesting. Okay, let's take a look at that. That's great. You may get what's called the foreground understanding, but you're not going to get the background understanding. And that's where years of experience, putting into play what has taken place, you sort of fill in the background of the why and the how. And I've called this in other videos the notion of jumping the experience queue. When you're attempting to use technology to the extent that it replaces a person, you miss out on the nuances. And that's why the dynamicness of mentoring is so important. And Doug and I have talked about this a lot because there's a lot of young entrepreneurs that are coming up, and they're saying, well, I can just go to Google, get what I need. And obviously, ChatGPT, all this AI technology that's coming in, people are jumping and saying, well, look, I can just go get everything there. What's the latest that you have found in your experience with entrepreneurs around sort of giving up on the person part, or maybe it has emphasized more? What's your thoughts around that, Doug?
What I'm noticing is that the lived experience of the mentor is far outweighing the use of technology to get the answers that you're looking for. It seems to have a bit more credibility when they hear this is what I did and this was the outcome as a result of me doing that way. And there are using mentoring process and techniques there. We can use the question and answer approach to be able to help get them to do some more critical thinking. The other part is that, and it's the critical thinking part, is the fact that I don't have to use that as much if I use the technology versus if I take, my lived experience as a mentor and share that, or I'm a mentee or a young entrepreneur, as you mentioned. If I'm a young entrepreneur, I want to be able to develop my critical thinking skills, and I can only do that, or I can do that a lot better when it comes to, doing it by sharing lived experience versus technology.
Yeah, it's always a little better when someone's sort of saying yes or no, or have you thought about it from this perspective, and having that collaborative conversation, that reciprocation that actually takes place. Words that Doug and I use quite often are deepen and enrichen, right? And that's what I believe mentoring while you're still in a person to person. I appreciate sometimes you move mentoring on to channels like this, right? Using the technology to support it. But you can still get the nuance aspects of it. It's sort of like when you look at my background, there's a whole bunch of things in the background, and some of you might be going, what's that? What's this? And what's that? And you might look at Doug. Doug's got 2 plants. Well, what kind of plants are they? It just adds to it a little bit more, because then I might point to something that's going on, and I might say, well, over here, I've got my books, and some of those books, let me grab one of those books. And I want to emphasize you can interact a little bit differently with the environment that's around you at this point in time. And so these are things to think about when it's more live. You can pull things, draw things in, pick things up. Like around my desk, all right, you don't see it, are other books and things. And I go, well, hang on a minute. Have you thought about getting a journal and working with a journal, right? And I'll pick up one of the journals that I've published, right, and make it available. Or I'll bring out a journal that I'm working with and say, have you thought about it from this perspective? Well, you may not get that if you're just asking Google for something. Google might say, well, record your thoughts in a journal. And I mean, versus, well, have you thought about it from a journal point of view? And here's a couple of different journal techniques that you can use. It's right there. It's dynamic. It's nuanced. It's there for you to work with. So I think that sort of reciprocation, the nuance, the importance of it, and not jumping the experience queue, and what Doug is sort of sharing. Is there anything else you want to add to the notion of that reciprocity storyline, Doug, before we move on to the holistic side of things?
We had have dived in or played in that space a little bit, where we looked at things from the reverse mentoring perspective, and what does reverse mentoring mean? And of course, I always, because my philosophy was, reverse means going backwards, and I'm sorry, but I don't do that sort of thing when it comes to mentoring. I'm going forward. So there was that part that I as we were talking, I wanted to share, because we've had conversations, albeit not directly dealing with the word reciprocity, but also, looking at it from the reverse mentoring perspective.
Yeah, and that's why I like the reciprocity, because for me it brings up the sense of, I give the imagery of weaving. You sort of in and out and up and down, and you're weaving it versus reverse. Well, I'll go back and get what I need to and come forward kind of idea. There's doesn't always feel as dynamic as to reciprocate kind of idea.
Yeah, and I guess I said reciprocity, and I meant to say reciprocal. So just so our listening audience doesn't, what's he talking about?
That's very good, very good. So the next thing we wanted to share with you is why we're using holistic. Often the language from a systems approach has sort of leaned into, well, there's this part of the system, there's this part of the system, when in fact, if you really dive into the systems world and how it has evolved, they start to speak more about the wholes of wholes. Like, I'm a whole person. I'm not part of something. I'm a whole inside of a whole system. So if I'm the mentor and Doug's the mentee, well, I'm a whole, Doug's a whole. The mentoring that we're doing is then going to be whole. That's what we're talking about, so that we don't start going, well, we'll put this here and we'll put that. No, you got to look at this whole thing about what's taking place. And this sort of leans into, often with mentoring, it's usually in some other bigger connection as well. So mentoring in the workplace, right? That means the organization's involved. It might be, well, I'm mentoring in a mental health, but that's within a community, and that could even be within an organization. There are other bigger pictures that influence this whole story. And we just wanted to bring that out. So when we go to share what we're talking about, yes, there's the mentoring arrangement and relationship, but it's also inside some other possibly culture, right, of an organization, a community approach, whatever is taking place. And we just want to acknowledge that, because, people don't do what they do in isolation, okay? You might say, well, I can come up with an example of ice. Oh, okay, great. All right. There might be an exception to what it is I'm sharing at the moment. But really, if you just sort of sit down and look at it, is we interact, whoever we are, in some way with other people somehow, even if it was the history of something, right? You're interacting with it in some capacity. So it's not just about personal growth. It's also about creating community. The mentoring that we're doing is also about creating communities, because as a mentor, and if Doug was the mentee, each of us is then interacting with communities, and maybe Doug's community wouldn't interact with mine, but then again, maybe they do. Again, we could take a look at the great butterfly effect that they sometimes talk about, what happens in ripples over here, ripples over in other places. So this holistic consideration is here now, just to remind us, is don't think about this as in isolation just between the mentor and the mentee. There is a wider ripple effect that actually takes place here. You want to share anything from your practice around that, Doug?
Around what part?
The holistic aspect of it, if you're thinking about applying and helping people understand the holistic aspect of mentoring?
Well, to me, the holistic piece is all about the aspect of, and you mentioned it at the beginning of this segment, which talked about, that you were whole as a person. And, that's one of the things that we talk about is the need, especially in the mental health space, is that I need to be whole as a person. So I need to, have those holistic approaches to what it is that I'm doing in order to be able to bring value to the mentoring arrangement or mentoring relationship.
So when Doug and I said, okay, where do we want to go? We're into 2023, halfway through. Is there anything we want to do that adjusts how we're going to unfold IMC to be of support not only to the mentor, the mentee, but to the community in a wider capacity? And we said, look, we had a series of different certificate levels. And we said, well, let's take a look at this. Let's take a look at the assumptions that we're making that people want to or can go or whatever it might be through stages. And then we said, well, hang on a minute. There's a lot of people who, like I deal with, who are professionals and paraprofessionals who have left that employment and are now doing other things. Doug is working with professionals and that who are still employed, but usually have a lot of bit of lived experience. And we both said to each other, well, why don't we just acknowledge the fact that they have this lived experience rather than making them jump through hoops? That's sort of language that people sometimes, why don't we just offer for those who really truly want to deep and enrich their understanding of mentoring, let's just have one certificate. And that certificate would be a practice. In other words, bring the concepts and practices to the foreground so that you truly understand what mentoring is. And if you wish to go that next step farther, which is to be certified, in other words, be verified in your practice to get your certification, then that's something that we can do. We're not going to make a big deal of it, but it is available to the persons that we're interacting with. So then Doug and I said, well, look, it's not that we're trying to create the verification to certification empire of mentoring. It wasn't what we were attempting to do. We were attempting to deepen and strengthen, improve, focus, enrich, whatever words you want to bring out there, this notion of mentoring that we have both found to be of great value, and to do it through this community system. So we said, okay, so we're going to offer a certificate of practice, journey mentor. In other words, really bring out the sense of the mentor, the journey aspect, the reciprocity, the holistic approach, right? That's what we said we would bring out, and we would help people to get to that point in time. And so that's what our sort of, how we're bringing it to the foreground. That was sort of what we wanted to share with you in terms of reframing it within IMC is just the one certificate, taking it forward. There's no master of it. There's no apprentice of it. There's nothing like that. That's what we wanted to offer and bring that forward, and really just sort of support people in truly understanding what is mentoring, mentorship, mentor, mentee, and really bring it to the foreground. And before we go into a bit of a summary, I just wanted to say thanks to Doug for having those conversations, because what it's done is I think it's really highlighted even the books we write, our own practices. And is there anything you want to add to that, Doug? You've certainly, well, guess what? Doug has been on the other side of the table, right, folks? So let's ask Doug, what's your thoughts here?
So for me, I was in the mentoring community doing what I do, and there was messages being, given to me, and the messages were basically, that the whole certification process, the 3 or 4 certifications that you have, that's really nice. That's kind of the upper end of what it is that we're looking for. We want something, kind of one that will provide us with the certification rigor that we need, but is more in tune to what we as an organization want or need. And so this, for me, this was, we listened, we heard, and now we're doing.
Yeah. And I think that's true. So when we go over the sort of 9 points we want to use to just sort of summarize where we're going with what we're doing, I think it will come to life, to light what we're sharing here. So I think let's dive into them, Doug, and just sort of bring them to the surface here. Okay. And in no particular order. This is not priority or anything like that. This is just us acknowledging this mentoring reframed, okay? we had thought about using something like Reinvented, and then we both looked at it and said, I'm not sure we're reinventing it. We're just reframing it at this point in time. So the first thing we would acknowledge, and it goes actually back in terms of in whatever organization, community you're doing what you're doing, make sure that you are adapting and evolving the mentoring program. If it's a program that you're doing, if it's just to you, then it would be your practice, because to meet the needs of the individuals and the organization, community, whichever way you want to look at it, we have to stay in front of with what is evolving in here. And, mental health, in terms of, the support of mental health, is really gained a lot of movement. Not that it wasn't there before, but it has certainly moved to the foreground. So the mentoring program has to, in a sense, mirror that, travel with it, walk parallel with that to be able to have that happen. So Doug, at any point in time, just jump in when you're ready to go. And so I'll just go to the next one, which is to make sure that you truly understand what peer-to-peer aspects of mentoring is about. Sometimes because someone is in a position and another person in a similar position comes together, it doesn't necessarily mean you want to put them together. Peer-to-peer can also, in this sense, is it's a peer of someone in the organization who has some lived experience that would be of value to you. Now, again, this is to Doug's point. They used to call it reverse. We don't. We talk about peer-to-peer, but it's to situate the peer-to-peer for tapping into the lived experience so that the mentee can get at what it is that they need to improve focus and strengthen their professional, their paraprofessional, their job responsibility, right? So truly understand what peer-to-peer means. The next one that we go over and think about, and we sort of hinted at it around this, is this whole notion of technology. What can this technology wave, and in some ways, it's like, whoa, I wouldn't call it a tsunami, but there's a lot of really interesting surfing waves that are out there from a technology point of view that can influence the mentor-mentee connections, especially on a global basis that you can tap into. And I know this, for example, is that if there is a question that comes up, you can immediately go to something like ChatGPT, put it in, well, let's see what the response is. Does that spark us? Or you can go to it later, and when you meet again, like a week later, you can bring some responses from that, or who else you've talked to. So technology is there, but truly understand the role of the technology in the mentoring conversation. So I'm going to make a bit of a distinction here. The technology has a great influence on the mentoring arrangement connection. And if it's not used correctly, you can get incorrect information about the relationship. And you don't want that to happen. Okay, so really pay attention to what the technology is doing. Technology can help the structure and some of the concepts you're looking for, but it may not support the relationship, the connections that you have with one another.
You can manage the technology, or you can allow the technology to manage you.
True enough. And I'm just finding it fascinating at the moment, because I go play with ChatGPT and I try to find out what does it know, what doesn't it know, how does it summarize what it thinks it knows, right? And all these kind of things, and constantly sort of poking into that world to see what comes up. And I'll go over to something like Midjourney and I'll put in mentoring arrangement, two people sitting at a table, and I'm curious what it comes back with, right? And some of the imagery, you sort of go, oh, okay, all right, that's telling me something about how it's thinking about it, but it may not be reflective of that prompt. So then what would you add into it? So again, it's using it to your advantage. So I'll leave it at that, and maybe another time we'll talk a little bit more and dive into what that's all about. The next thing is to make sure that you provide continuous education, continual learning, continual improvement in what it means to be a mentor and a mentee, and to develop the mentorship in general. I think that goes without being said. I did say it, but it's important to remind us of that. Now, there's another one that I'm finding to be kind of interesting. And part of that is because of the work that we do in the international mentoring community. We built a community leaning into the world of ISO, the International Standards Organizations and Regulations, also the environmental, occupational health, and safety perspective in terms of managing situations. And what that did was it brings up guidelines and frameworks. I don't know if you've found this. I don't think I've ever asked you this, Doug, so this might be a question to ask, or maybe I did and I can't remember. Anyway, is the importance of, if you're in an organization, to set up the guidelines and frameworks to get the mentoring arrangements set up, to support the mentoring relationships, and then allowing some variations, nuanced development to take place between the mentor and the mentee. Do you actually, let me put in a question to you. When you setting up the mentoring program, do you emphasize this notion of guidelines and frameworks for the mentoring arrangement, or do you just sort of leave that to the organization?
Well, it's a collaborative approach. So it's both the organization along with myself kind of shaping and molding, because what we try to do is customize the solution to the organization and its people.
So you're sharing frameworks and guidelines. This one popped up, and I actually had to sort of slow down in my own, and sometimes you can zip right by some of these, but this one I went, is IMC using guidelines and frameworks per se? And then I suddenly went, yeah, well, okay, one of the frameworks is the profile of the action outcome statements. Okay. Another framework is what we call the mentoring model, right? And it's just the way in which we draw it in sort of a two-dimensional, and then we share it. And then when we meet in videos, or if we're meeting in person, we bring it to life in the room as this sort of mentoring model that we have. And then obviously the guidelines are there in terms of how you do the certification. But I almost zipped by it without actually confirming it in my own way of thinking. So it was great when we put this together. It got me to slow down. And I thought, oh, this is kind of interesting. Sometimes you're gonna learn even when you're presenting, even if it's just to remember that you are putting it in action. So I thought it was kind of interesting. The next thing is, from an organization point of view, there is this notion of rewards and recognition. Goes without saying. But sometimes we may not do the rewards and recognition sort of concept if you're doing this notion of mentoring, and it's not in an organization or a community, and it might be within the friends, it might be within family, it might be, it's not as formalized. I think we use things like thank you, right, when we get into it. But as a mentor, to be a little bit more aware of the gratitude, the rewards and recognition, the appreciations, the celebrations aspect of mentoring is really important. And sometimes that's something that I understand a lot of people just zip by. And I just wanted to emphasize it. Thoughts on that one, Doug? Because I think this is one that we probably don't talk about as much as we could. But I think from a reframing of mentoring going forward with the dynamics that are going on out there, we have to say thank you to each other a lot more and find the connection, the collaboration rather than the separation. Thoughts?
Well, and I know from an arrangement perspective that having the mentor and the mentee sort of, I guess the easiest way is to be appreciative of the effort of both in keeping the arrangement or the relationship at the forefront so that they get the value, both parties get the value from the experience, the deeper, richer experience. We want to make sure that they do get that value. And to do that, there needs to be that, what we're talking about, right?
Oh, for sure. And folks, if you're watching, there's the chat function. If not, afterwards, there's the comment function around wherever you find this video. So I certainly encourage you to subscribe, comment, like, and share those kind of things. But add in, because what we're attempting to do is, because we're reframing it, we may get caught in our own bias, right, Doug? And we talk about the notion of mentoring bias, and we may get caught in it. We could certainly appreciate what you've got to share, is because the last point that I wanted to make mention of is, I'm going to use the word embed, all right, with intent, place reciprocal and holistic mentoring, those words, into what it is that you're doing. Truly understand the reciprocity, the mutuality that is here in mentoring. This, you are, in a sense, peer-to-peer. You're not one over the other. There is this reciprocity. Both of you can learn from what's taking place. So make sure that that's there, that's present. And as a mentor, as you remain conscious to this, through conscious listening, right, and responsive sharing, just keep asking yourself, am I still learning? Am I getting something through my reflection? Is really keep asking that of yourself, right? Even if it's about, yes, I'm improving my practice. Yes, I'm gaining more focus on the ways in which I'm sharing things with the mentee. Yes, I'm acknowledging the mentee is giving me reflective points back to acknowledge it, because that's what gets the holistic, right? Is that the wholes of the wholes are being brought forward. And Doug mentioned to me when he started to get into this whole world of connecting mentoring and mental health, he said, look, we have to start dealing with the whole person from a mentoring point of view. You can't just accept what's presented and not look at the whole person that's sitting across from you. Well, guess what? The mentee has to understand there's a whole person called a mentor sitting across from them. And it's situated in a whole situation, depending if you're in an organization, you're in a workplace, a community, whatever it might be. So we're asking you, share with us what your thoughts are so that we can improve what we're doing, focus and strengthen. But before we close that off, anything about that one, Doug?
Not that comes to mind, no.
Yeah, because Doug and I, this is one that we talk about a lot. And this one actually is the one that really sparked us to go, certificate of practice, journey mentor, let's acknowledge where everyone is, right? Let's not put them through hoop jumping just for the sake of doing that. We could spend more time really helping people develop their practice and helping them get out to do what it is that they're doing, and not complicate this with a whole bunch of convoluted different levels and stages and all that kind of stuff. That's sort of where this one came from as well. So I think that what we've done is we've given you a little bit more about what we're doing, with the why and how of mentoring, halfway through 2023 from a IMC point of view. And this title of mentoring, an important comma, reframed. Okay. I almost said reinvented. Oh, I did say reinvented. No, it's reframed. Mentoring, comma, reframed. That's what we're doing from an IMC perspective. Anything from an overview point of view before we go towards the closing that you want to at this point, Doug? No, okay. So, as in our Mentoring Lounge live broadcasts, is I bring us in and Doug takes us out. So, as we're getting ready to go out, I'll just acknowledge Doug for all the work he's done and all the reframing that we've been doing over the last little bit. I so appreciate what it is that you're doing, and thank you for that. So when Doug has finished giving his thoughts to close off, and I know that he's closed off, I'm just going to say take care. And then what will happen is that we'll just shut down the broadcasts and the stream. So Doug, over to you for closing out.
So I hope that today our listening and viewing audience got the opportunity to think about where they see mentoring going for the next 6 to 12 months and how can they play a part in shaping how it's going to end up turning out. And as long, the big thing that I want to take away from this today for all of us is let's make sure that we've taken something away from it that is going to provide us some sort of direction as to where we're going in the next 6 to 12 months.
For sure. Well, thank you. Take care, everyone.